Welcome viewers to part 4 of the camera system install. In this video we're going to continue where we left off. We had just installed the power supply unit and also the cables through to the head unit, and here we will continue with the install. Now the next thing we need to take care of is the connections to the power supply. Now the power supply has a positive and a negative, and also a live sensing wire which is connected to your lights or something, which when you turn the ignition on it gives a 12-volt positive, and that turns the camera system on automatically. Now I was going to try and use one of these devices, which is a fuse adapter that you put into the fuse box, and when you put that into the fuse box, and I have another video explaining how that works, it gives you two fuses, one for the original circuit and one for the new accessory which you're going to connect to. So I tried putting this in by removing one of the fuses, and I was going to use the horn fuse, which is the one on the bottom right. And if you didn't know, underneath the seat there's a fuse puller. It's just nestled in the seat, ready to be used. It's a handy thing to have, or to know where it is if you get stuck, because they can be a bit difficult to get out if you haven't got one of these. So you just push it over the fuse and pull it up, and it comes out very easily. I then tried to attach the adapter when I find it, of course, and it went in okay, no problem. And it looked like it would work perfectly because there was space there to get the two fuses in. So I tried to put the lid on it, on the fuse box, and you will find that on the NT1100 the fuse box lid is very, very tight to the top of the fuses, so you haven't got any space at all to have anything protruding from what the fuses are there already. So I tried and it wouldn't fit, so I had to give up on that option and use a different method. So we took this adapter back out again and we threw it away, or we kept it for another job. So what I had to use was an inline fuse. Luckily enough, I had an inline fuse which was connected to some power accessory sockets and USB sockets, which I'm going to use on the bike anyway. And these I connected as follows. I put two ring connectors on the one on the positive, one on the negative, and that gives me a 12-volt supply fused to power some accessories. So these, I've took the fuse out of there to make sure it's not going to put any power anywhere when I connect it up. And I'm now going to put the negative on first, and then I'm going to put the positive on, and then we'll have our supply which we can then take to the power supply unit. Now this power is going to be on all the time to the camera system, and the reason being is the camera system has a function where if the bike is turned off, it will still record if it gets knocked or banged in any way. So it's a nice little bit of a security thing to have. And I had this on the NC750X, and there was no problem with power draining or anything like that when it was turned on. So I was quite happy to put that on here. So here we're putting the negative on. Now when I take the battery off, I tried to keep the negative connected to the battery so the battery didn't become physically disconnected from the bike, just in case when you disconnect the battery completely that it knocks out any settings or something that's on the motorbike. So I don't think it would make any difference if you did disconnect the battery, but it just saves a little bit of hassle should it cause any problems. So there I had the negative on, which is the black wire. I'm now going to do the same to the positive wire. We'll get the positive on, and then that should give us a 12-volt supply going out through that fuse to them red and black wires, and we can take anything we like off there. It doesn't take very long to do. It takes longer to solder all the wires up and things than it does to install it. And this, connecting it to the battery, means that our 12-volt power sockets, which we're putting on, we can take as much current as we like out of there, limited only by the fuse size. I'm only going to put a 3-amp fuse in there. The reason being is I'm not going to put any more than that, and the camera system only takes about 750 milliamps, which is 3/4 of an amp, so I'm quite happy with 3 amps. Now these two power sockets, one is a twin USB 2-amp, and one is a 12-volt power socket, like a lighter socket we used to call them. Now I'm going to thread these cables through a bit of tubing so they're nice and tidy, because when you put these any wiring on your motorbike, try and do it as tidy as you possibly can. Sometimes it's not possible to do it 100% tidy, but just try the best you can to make it to a good standard, and you won't have any issues going forward. So I put a little bit on there, and these two sockets that you can see there, I'm going to make a 3D printed bracket, so they're held in there, in that position there, so I can access them from just lifting up the rear seat. And there'll be another video coming along on how I make that and how we print it, and that's probably be more of interest to the 3D printing viewers who follow my channel as well. Now I just clipped this onto the rubber band that holds the toolbox in, coming very handy that did. And all we need to do now is to connect the positive and the negatives together and connect them to that fused circuit that we have just created. But before we do that, let's just tidy up the cables just a little bit. We're going to put a little cable tie around here and make them nice and tidy. As you go along, just try and find the best place to put cables before you physically position them finally, because sometimes you'll position something and then further down the installation you'll say, well, hang on, it could have been done a different way. Now I'm thinking of attaching this fuse holder, the inline fuse holder, again to the side of the bike with a bit of 3M tape, and that's what I ended up doing actually. So first of all, make sure it all fits before you start to solder all the wires. During the next couple of minutes there's going to be some speedy sections where I speed things up just to make the video a little bit easier on the viewer. And as you can see here, I'm putting a cloth underneath where I'm going to be soldering, so that if I drop any hot solder, it won't go down into the bike itself or into any wiring anywhere. So it's a good precaution to do. Now we need to tin the ends of the wires which we stripped earlier on. We're going to use the solder line and a bit of solder for that. Then we need some heat shrink sleeving put onto the cables to protect the cables and insulate them once we've soldered the two joints up. Now we've just put a bit of black sleeving, heat shrink sleeving over the black, which is the negative. We're now going to put some heat shrink sleeving over the positive, which is the red cable. We're also going to put a smaller piece of heat shrink over the cable. This will go over the joint itself, and then we will pull over the bigger heat shrink at a later date. I was just measuring the size of it to make sure it's long enough before I put it on. So there's the black. That'll just go inside that larger heat sink there for a short period of time. And we'll do the same with this one. So make sure you don't leave these bits of heat shrink too near where you're soldering, because what will happen is when you're soldering, the heat will transfer to the cable and the heat shrink will start to shrink down, and you might not be able to slide it along the cable. So here we are, we're just going to tin the ends of these two wires that we twisted together using the solder once again, and we're going to heat the wire up from the bottom and put the solder onto the cable, the wire, and we're going to do the same with the bottom one, the positive, by heating the wire up and putting the solder onto the wire, which is the best way to get the solder onto the cable correctly. Once we've tinned both ends, we now need to bring these two ends together, the two reds and the two blacks, and we're going to solder them together to complete the joint in the cable. As you can see there, we've done the red one, and we're going to also do the black one. I had a little bit of difficulty here, so I've had to use one hand to hold the two cables together. It can be a bit tricky, but once you get a bit of practice, you should be no problem. So now we're going to slide the heat shrink over the two soldered joints that we've done. Just going to check the fuse is not in the connector, in the holder, which it isn't. So we're going to slide first of all the negative, which is the black, and the red, which is the positive, over the joint. And then we're going to use a hot air gun. I'm going to set the temperature about 300 degrees on that. And what that will do is when we heat up the heat shrink, it will shrink down onto the size of the cable. We'll do this with the red and also with the black. Now, if you haven't got a heat gun, you can use a standard lighter. Just hold the flame under the heat shrink and move the flame up and down, and that will heat shrink it just as good. You might get a bit of black marking on it, but it works just as good. And once you've got the cables soldered together, we check the connections on the positive and negative. We check the fuse is not in the fuse holder, and here is the positive supply going through the fuse, and here is the type of fuse that goes in there, a small blade fuse. Not going to put it in now. That then goes down to two power sockets, which we're going to install, as well as the power supply for the camera system. So we're now going to put the cables in a little bit tidy by putting the cable tie around the cable there, first of all. Now, if you're putting cables and wires, adding them to your motorbike, make sure you try and make them as clean as you possibly can, as tidy as you possibly can, and it always makes the whole installation just a little bit nicer. And if anybody looks inside the motorbike, they can see that you've done a really good job and took care in doing it. Now, this cable tie was a little bit tight getting around the bend, but eventually I got the cable tie around to tighten the final one. And then once we've got that cable tie in and the cable's in the right position, we're now going to stick the fuse holder to the side of the motorbike on the frame. And we're also going to put the cover on the battery positive terminal so it can't be touched inadvertently with any metal objects such as spanners and things. So get rid of all your little tails on your cable ties, cut them all off nice and neat. And here is the 3M tape. We're going to put that on the side of the fuse holder, and we're going to remove the backing and stick it to the frame of the motorbike. And this should be pretty secure for the fuse holder to remain in place while we take the fuse in and out as well. So there it goes, it's getting stuck onto the frame. It sticks really well with 3M tape, and we'll just check that we can take the fuse cap on and off. We haven't stuck it to anything, which is all okay, looking good. And just to finish it all off, if you have any loose cables or routing that needs doing, just tidy them up with a couple of cable ties and we're ready to go on to the next stage. Now, the next thing we need to do, is the final job to do on the connection of the power supply, is to install a sense lead. And what this will do is when the bike is turned on and off, it will automatically power on your camera system to work before you ride away. Now this is where I encountered a slight problem. I intended to connect the cable to the rear light, which is always on when the bike's on. So I tested the connections on the plug on the back of the motorbike to try and find out which one was the permanent power to the light. But as I tried to find out the which one it was, I noticed that I could only get 0.7 volts on any one of them three connections, which means that they're feeding the supply to an LED, which it must be LED lights on the back, from another power source somewhere on the motorbike. So I had to abandon that and have a look elsewhere to get a connection. The only other place which I could think which was a good place to go would be directly to the fuse box. There's no spare fuses in here, and I wanted to connect it to the horn fuse because that's not really a critical device. It's the bottom right hand one on that top cover. So I pulled the fuse box terminal out, and it's only held on a tab on the bike. It's easy to remove, and I checked that there was power on the common side of the bottom three fuses, and here I've got power on there, 12 volts, which is correct. Now the output of the fuse is on the opposite side, so I put my tester on the output of the horn fuse, which is that bottom right hand side one, and I got 12 volts, which is correct. I then turned the ignition off to prove that the power would go off and on again, and I turned it off again because I want to work on it. So now I know that is the wire that I'm going to connect my sense lead to. So I had to pull the cables back, the yellow cable, back to where the control unit is, and route it towards the fuse box ready for connection, which only took a couple of seconds. It wasn't a big job. And then I cut all the excess cable off and stripped the end of the cable. Now I didn't have any connectors or anything tapping connectors to get onto that cable, so I decided to strip back about 5mm of cable, the insulation from the cable, using a modeling knife. And as you can see here, I'm just taking the insulation off the wire with a knife, and you can just about see there's a bit of cable showing underneath there. Once I'd exposed the copper cable, I wrapped up the sense lead cable around that copper cable, and once I did that, the only thing I needed to do was then to solder this to make it a good connection. So that's what we did. We soldered it with the soldering iron, as you can see here. It only took a couple of minutes. Now this means that I have the horn cable going out to supply the horn, and it also supplies the sense lead to our power supply unit for the cameras. Now you can add a fuse in there if you wish, would make it a little bit more safer, but I didn't have a fuse to put in that circuit to protect it, but I'm not too concerned about it, so I left it as it is, just like that. Now obviously we don't want to leave this cable bare, so what I did, I got some epoxy resin, and I proceeded to use the epoxy resin to enclose the cable joint which I had just soldered. Now you might have to mix the resin, such as arrowdite or something like that, let it go a little bit stiff before you apply it, because if it's too runny it will run off the joint. So I put some on, left it for a few minutes, and then when it was a little bit more thicker, I could then build it up around the actual connection itself. And once it was finished, you get a joint such like this, where the arrowdite or the epoxy covers the whole of the joint, and it's all waterproof, it's well insulated, and it should not cause any issues going forward. So all we need to do now is finally check all the wiring to make sure everything is in place and there's nothing being missed. We start off by make sure the lid's on the fuse box. The cable for the sense lead is all nice in and tidy, and going back towards the control unit, make sure that connector is tight. Check the positive supply cable to make sure it's connected, secured and routed correctly. We check there's no fuse in it, but we're going to put one in there later. Check the 2 positive supplies down to the additional sockets that we've put in. One is a 12-volt power socket, live all the time from the battery, even if the ignition's off, because that's what I want it to be. And also there is a twin 2-amp USB socket there as well for powering items which will be under my seat. And we also have power going to the control unit, which is for the camera system. And that completes the install of the power supply unit for the camera system on the NT1100. And in the next video, part 5, we will be completing the installation by mounting the front camera and plugging the head unit into the control unit and applying the power and giving it a test. So we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.